All right, so picture this. You're at the polls, right? But it's not like how it is today. It's not all quiet and organized at those little booths. Instead, it's like a giant party. There's a rowdy crowd, maybe even some music playing, and people are getting into fights.
Oh, and to top it all off, the candidates are buying drinks for everyone. Sounds more like a tailgate party than an election, right?
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but early voting in America was really something else. It was chaotic and definitely susceptible to all sorts of, well, shenanigans, let's just
No,
say.
exactly. Today we're going on a deep dive into the history of voting in the U.S. We'll be looking at an episode of NPR's Throughline podcast to see how this whole thing evolved. From those crazy early days to the system we have now.
And you know what's really fascinating about this journey? It's not just about changes in technology. It's also about how our ideas about citizenship representation and democracy itself have changed.
That's a great point. So let's go way back to the early days of the United States. Back then, voting was often done by viva voce, literally with living voice. Oh yeah, with viva voce, you had to shout out your choice for everyone to hear. Can you imagine the pressure?
I can't even imagine. Talk about feeling put on the spot. It's incredible how much voting has changed over time.
It really is. And you know, that practice of viva voce voting really shows how they thought about voting back then. It was a public act. It was like you were showing everyone your civic duty, like you were pledging your allegiance or something.
Right. It was about community decision making,
Yeah,
but of course, it was also super easy to manipulate and intimidate people,
absolutely.
especially when you had people like George Washington encouraging voters, shall
Yeah.
we say, with a lot of alcohol.
Oh, yeah, that was a thing. Washington's campaign in 1757 for the House of Burgesses in Virginia is a perfect example. He gave voters 46 gallons of beer, a whole hogshead of rum punch, and 35 gallons of wine. I mean, talk about a campaign strategy.
That's one way to get people to vote for you. I wonder what my local polling place would say about a rum punch fountain. But seriously, it really shows how different things were back then.
Yeah, it really does. And as the country grew and elections got more competitive, even counting the votes became a nightmare. So they tried all sorts of things, like using corn kernels or beans to represent votes.
That's amazing. It's wild to think how far we've come from those early forms of balloting. But it makes you wonder, at what point did they realize this whole public voting thing wasn't really working?
Well, things got even more complicated when political parties came along. The parties wanted to make sure their people voted the right way, so they started printing their own ballots and handing them out through their newspapers.
So instead of shouting your vote, you now had these physical things that showed your party loyalty. I bet that made things even more heated and divisive.
You're telling me these party tickets were often big and colorful, you know? They really wanted to make sure people saw them. Imagine walking around with this giant red or blue piece of paper, practically shouting your political beliefs.
Yikes. Especially during a time when political differences were already causing so much tension.
Exactly. And for people who supported the minority party in their area, it could be really dangerous.
It's crazy to think that people were actually attacked and even killed just for carrying the wrong ballot.
It's a dark part of our history. Back in 1859, there was this Democrat named George Kyle. He was attacked and shot at, and his brother was actually killed, and all because they were carrying their party's ballot.
Wow, that's awful.
Yeah,
It really shows you how high the stakes were
yeah.
and how vulnerable voters were to intimidation and coercion.
It does. And all of this was happening while the country was industrializing and economic inequality was growing, so there were even more opportunities for people to be taken advantage of, especially those who were struggling to get by.
Right, people were desperate.
Exactly. And that's when we see the rise of vote buying. Impoverished voters were basically bribed for their votes. Imagine being so desperate for food or basic necessities that you'd sell your vote for a couple of dollars or a meal.
It's heartbreaking. It just shows how economic hardship can completely undermine a fair and democratic system.
It's a tragic reality, and it was a big reason why people started demanding voting reforms. They saw that the system they had with the public displays and the partisan ballots was just too easy to manipulate. Something had to change.
I can see why. It's true. And then came the Civil War, and that threw a whole other wrench into the system. I mean, suddenly you have a huge chunk of the voters who were soldiers fighting on the battlefields. How are they supposed to vote?
Exactly. The whole question of whether soldiers should vote and how they should vote became a major issue. On the one hand, you have people saying that soldiers are fighting and dying for their country. They deserve to have a say in its future.
And on the other, I imagine there were concerns about how to make it work logistically, and probably worries about fraud and maybe even some political gamesmanship going on, trying to sway the war's outcome with soldier votes.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very complicated situation with incredibly high stakes. Some states tried absentee voting, where soldiers could mail in their ballots, and others tried proxy voting, where soldiers would choose someone else to vote for them.
I can see how both of those could be open to abuse, especially in the middle of a war.
Oh, yeah, there are tons of accusations about ballots being lost or tampered with, delays in delivery, forged ballots, you name it. Don't forget, this was a very partisan time, and both sides were trying to use the soldier vote to their advantage.
So despite all the problems and controversies, the 1864 election went ahead with soldiers voting. It's pretty amazing they managed to do it at all during such a chaotic time.
It really is. It shows how strongly people believed in the power of voting. Even in the middle of a civil war, the system wasn't perfect by any means, but the fact that they held a national election at all during that time, it really shows how resilient American democracy is.
But even after the war ended, it seems like the fight for a fair and equal voting system wasn't over.
Not even close. There was still intimidation and coercion and vote buying, especially as the country trying to figure out Reconstruction and the fight for civil rights was still going on.
And that's when we see the rise of this game-changing idea, the Australian ballot. Can you tell us a bit more about what made this system so different and how it came to America?
Sure, the Australian ballot actually started in Australia in the mid-1800s. It was a whole package of reforms meant to fix the problems we've been talking about. The idea was to make voting more private, more secure, and harder to manipulate.
It sounds like a huge improvement from the days of shouting your vote or carrying around those giant party tickets.
It was a major shift. One of the biggest changes was that the government started supplying the ballots. Instead of the parties printing their own, which made it easy to see how someone voted, now everyone got a standardized ballot with all the candidates and parties listed.
So you're not going into the polling place with a big sign showing everyone who you support anymore. That must have made a huge difference in terms of intimidation.
You bet. And to make things even more private, they came up with private voting booths. You'd get your ballot, go into this little booth where you could mark your choices in secret, and then you'd put your ballot in a secure box.
It sounds like a much fairer and less scary way to vote. But you said earlier that even reforms with good intentions can have unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's true. The secret ballot was meant to give voters more power and reduce corruption, but it also accidentally created a problem for people who couldn't read.
That's an important point. If you can't read the ballot, you can't really vote.
Exactly. And this is where the story gets even more complicated, especially after the Civil War. While the secret ballot was seen as a progressive reform in the North, in the South, it was used to take away voting rights, especially from black voters.
So even though the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, Southern states found new ways to stop them from voting. And the secret ballot, ironically, became a tool for disenfranchisement.
Exactly. Southern states wanted to keep white supremacy, and they saw the secret ballot as a way to get around the 15th Amendment without technically breaking it.
It's amazing and also really depressing how something designed to protect the vote could be used to keep people from voting. But how did they do that? How did they use the secret ballot to disenfranchise people?
Well, they started using literacy tests and other restrictions that took advantage of the fact that voters now had to read and mark their ballots on their own. A lot of black voters who hadn't been allowed to get an education under slavery were suddenly faced with these impossible obstacles that basically took away their right to vote.
It's a terrible irony, and it shows that the fight for voting rights never really ends. There are always new challenges and new ways to suppress votes. But before we move on, I'm curious about how widely the Australian ballot was adopted in the U.S.
It spread like wildfire. By the end of the 1800s, most states had adopted some version of it. And that laid the foundation for the voting system we use today.
So the system we have now with the private booths and standardized ballots is basically a result of this reform movement from the late 1800s, a movement that was driven by both progressive ideas and, unfortunately, attempts to take away voting rights from certain groups.
That's right. And while it's important to recognize the good things about the Australian ballot, it's also crucial to understand its complicated history and how it's been used both to empower and to disenfranchise voters.
You know, it's interesting to think about how we went from those early days of public voting to the private system we have now. It makes you wonder if something got lost along the way.
It's definitely something to think about. Some people say that moving to the secret ballot, while it was important for protecting voters, it may have also made people less engaged in their communities and less responsible as citizens.
Yeah, I can see that. When voting was a public thing, it was also like a social event, a chance to be with your community and participate in something together. Now it feels more like a chore, something you have to squeeze into your busy day.
And with more people voting by mail or absentee ballot, even that small sense of community is going away. It really makes you wonder how we can get people more involved in their communities and excited about voting.
Right. It shouldn't feel like an obligation. We talked about how early elections were like big parties with music and food and maybe a little too much alcohol. I'm not saying we need to go back to that exactly, but maybe we could bring back some of that festive atmosphere, make Election Day feel more special.
I think that's a great idea. Making Election Day a national holiday would be a good start. People wouldn't have to work, so they could focus on voting.
I love that idea. And maybe we could have more community events around elections, like voter registration drives and candidate forums, maybe even some live music and food trucks at the polling places. Make it more fun and engaging.
Absolutely. Imagine turning polling places into these lively community centers where people can talk and connect and celebrate democracy. It would be so different from those quiet, boring voting booths we have now.
And with all the new technology we have, we should think about how we can use it to make voting easier and more accessible, like maybe online voting.
That's a possibility for sure. But we have to be very careful about security and making sure that no one can manipulate the votes. Any new system has to be secure and transparent, and it has to accurately reflect what the people want.
It's a tricky balance, finding ways to modernize and be innovative while still protecting the core values of democracy, fairness, transparency, and the right for everyone to have their voice heard.
Exactly, and we all need to be part of this conversation. The history of voting in America shows that we're always trying to create a better country, and that journey is still going on.
This has been such an eye-opening look at the history of voting in the U.S. It's incredible to see how far we've come from the days of public voting and party tickets. But it's also clear that many of the same challenges are still with us, making sure that voting is fair and accessible for everyone.
It reminds us that the right to vote is precious, and it didn't come easy. It's the result of centuries of fighting, debating, and coming up with new ideas, and it's up to every single one of us to not just vote, but to also have thoughtful conversations about how we can keep improving and protecting our democracy for future generations.
So to all our listeners, if you want to learn more about this fascinating topic, we highly recommend listening to the full episode of NPR's Throughline podcast that we've been talking about. And remember, the story of voting isn't over. We're all writing it together.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And never take your right to vote for granted.